In the tangled alleyways of medieval England, particularly in the burgeoning towns of the 14th century, one profession stood alone in both necessity and revulsion. You might never hear of them in chivalric tales or sermons delivered from cathedral pulpits, but without their work, cities would have drowned in their own filth. They were the gong farmers, men who toiled in the darkness beneath castles and tenements, scraping, shoveling, and hauling away human waste by hand. The word gong didn't begin as a sound. In Middle English, it came from the word gang, meaning to go, specifically, to go to the toilet. Thus, a gong farmer was one who farmed the gong, which is to say, harvested what the human body left behind. It was less poetic than it sounds. By day, townsfolk bustled about, conducting trade, gossiping in marketplaces, and attending mass. But come nightfall, when the bustle died down and torches flickered on stone walls, the gong farmers emerged. They crept into yards and beneath buildings, slipping into cesspits dug beneath latrines, often accessible only by crawling through narrow tunnels or descending rotting ladders. In the 1300s, particularly in London and other growing urban centers, the job became more organized. You might find a gong farmer listed in guild records or even sanctioned by city councils. Though it was one of the lowest rungs in society, it was, curiously, not the poorest. Because of the filth, risk, and isolation, gong farmers were paid comparatively well, at least by the standards of a thatched roof economy. Some sources suggest they could earn sixpence to a shilling per cesspit. If they worked several pits in a night, they might make as much as a skilled tradesman. But the risks were not merely social. Imagine this. It's a winter night. The stars are veiled in soot from hearth fires. You're descending into a wooden-lined hole with a lantern and a shovel. The air is thick with the smell of decomposition, disease, and rot. Methane gas seeps invisibly from the pit, threatening to ignite or suffocate. The shovel clinks against something unyielding. Not rock, not wood. A bone? A corpse? Perhaps. Medieval law didn't always account for where the waste stopped, and criminal secrets began. Despite these horrors, or perhaps because of them, gong farmers formed their own quiet brotherhood. There are few records of riots or dissent among them, but many petitions and notes from city officials ensuring they had designated disposal sites. In London, one such location was Laystall Street, where night soil was dumped, sometimes, later sold as fertilizer to nearby farms. In the country, waste became a commodity. In cities, it was a public threat. Gong farmers straddled both these worlds. They were required to work only at night, not merely for convenience, but because their presence during the day was considered offensive to the respectable senses of the public. In some places, they were legally barred from living within certain boroughs. Children were told to stay away from them, lest the smell stick. Some chroniclers claim that after years in the job, the stench became permanent, etched into skin, breath, and clothing. Whether this was true or simply another way to shun them is lost to time. One might wonder, why would anyone do such a job? The answer, as with most things in history, lies in a mix of desperation, exclusion, and opportunity. Many gong farmers were previously unemployed laborers, disabled veterans, or men with criminal pasts barred from other forms of employment. Others inherited the job from family, with cesspits becoming a dark and stinking family business. Yet the easier gong farmer was not without agency. A clever one could negotiate his rates. Some even purchased wagons, hired assistants, and expanded into rudimentary waste management services. One record from York describes a man who operated a gong boat that sailed the Ouse River to transport waste to fields upstream. This innovation didn't earn him fame, but it likely earned him enough coin to live modestly and independently, rare for a man of his class. And lest you assume they were completely unloved, consider this. When outbreaks of disease struck cities, it was often the gong farmers who knew which neighborhoods were overrun with waste, where pits overflowed, and which houses ignored their obligations. In a strange twist, they became informants of hygiene. The plague, that invisible hunter, had no mercy, but knowledge of sanitation often marked the line between a plague-ridden street and a spared one. In fact, in some towns, city officials began to consult gong farmers when planning new neighborhoods. Their experience told them how many households a cesspit could support before it needed draining. And in particularly grim times, like the Black Death, when mortality was so high that normal gravediggers couldn't keep up. Gong farmers were sometimes conscripted to help bury the dead. Their profession made them immune to few things, least of all dignity, but they remained, in their strange way, essential. Still in popular culture, they were grotesque figures. Satirical plays portrayed them as half-human goblins. Jesters joked about their dinners. Priests warned that such a career might signal divine punishment. And yet, without them, civilization would quite literally collapse into itself. The growing city required a growing workforce of invisible men. But as with many professions that served an essential, if unglamorous, role in society, the decline of the Gong farmer would eventually come. With it came new forms of waste disposal, new technologies, and shifting social landscapes. Before that transition, though, something curious happened. In the records of 15th century Coventry, a particular Gong farmer, known only as W.H., is mentioned repeatedly, not for scandal, but for a civic dispute. His pits, it seems, had been leaking into the river, but when summoned before the mayor, W.H. didn't appear. The reason? He had purchased a tavern with his earnings and begun to hire men to do the digging for him. In a time when upward mobility was rare, W.H. had climbed out of the pit and into business. Who was this man, really? A low-born sewer worker turned property holder? A city nuisance? A forgotten entrepreneur of waste? His story ends there in the records, but the thought lingers. What must it have been like to rise, however briefly, from the bottom of society, covered in muck, and claim a piece of the city above? You now know the basics, the stench, the stigma, and the startling necessity of the Gong farmer's life. But what happens when you take this reviled, moonlit labor and place it within the grander system of medieval society? That's where things become unexpectedly illuminating. This section will dig deeper, not just into the latrines and cesspits of the medieval world, but into the social structures, economies, and evolving infrastructures that made such a job so enduring. While most history books are eager to describe battles, dynasties, or even farming techniques, they often pass over one fundamental aspect of life in medieval towns: the sheer logistical nightmare of living together without plumbing. To live in a medieval city, especially in England during the 13th through 16th centuries, meant sharing walls, roofs, streets, and yes, privies. In larger cities like London, York, or Norwich, tenements often housed multiple families. These structures were hastily constructed and poorly maintained. In some cases, they shared a single jakes, a term for a medieval latrine, built over a cesspit, and that pit would inevitably fill. Especially in wealthier households, privies were constructed indoors and emptied discreetly, preferably not by the residents themselves. When the pit beneath a jakes became too full, its odor became unbearable, attracting rats, flies, and disease. That's where Gong farmers came in. By royal ordinance, London had declared as early as the 14th century that all night soil must be removed and taken beyond the city walls to avoid contamination of the water supply. These soil carts became a familiar part of the night soundscape: rumbling wheels, splashing buckets, and the low murmur of workers moving through the fog. So what, you might ask, did they do with all that waste? The answer was more sophisticated than you might expect. Human waste, particularly when composted with straw and animal dung, made effective fertilizer. Gong farmers developed relationships with rural farmers, who often lacked access to enough manure to sustain their fields. The night soil, hauled out in wagons or sometimes even in boats, was sold at modest prices to agriculturalists. This gave rise to a shadow economy, not exactly illegal, but not formally regulated either. The very waste urban dwellers wished to forget was transformed into wealth under the cover of darkness. This commerce required infrastructure. Lay stalls, temporary dung heaps, were designated throughout medieval cities to serve as temporary dumping sites. Gong farmers would collect from households and empty into the lay stalls, from which waste was periodically removed. But competition arose. Not all Gong farmers operated under official license. Some worked independently, hauling waste only to dump it in rivers or abandoned lots. These freelance Gong farmers were viewed with suspicion, not only because of yobi, the stench they left behind, but because they violated a fragile system of urban sanitation. City authorities responded in bureaucratic fashion. In 1388, Parliament passed the Statute of Cambridge, partially in response to fears about the spread of disease, mandating local jurisdictions to regulate waste removal more tightly. Certain towns required gong farmers to carry badges or tokens to prove their legitimacy. In London, the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, curiously enough, was occasionally assigned to inspect sanitation reports, including the activities of waste collectors. Still, the line between public service and nuisance was razor thin. Gong farmers were both essential and detested. They were not allowed to enter some churches, markets, or even barber shops. A curious case from 1422 describes a gong farmer being denied a room at an inn despite showing coin in hand. The justification? His smell was ruinous to the linens. He slept instead in the stable. Yet for all the ostracism, some farmers began to accrue small fortunes. The late 15th century in England was a time of relative economic expansion, and savvy workers found ways to increase efficiency. One such individual, named only Tom of Fleet Ditch, ran a multi-man operation with carts and barrels. He charged premium rates for emergencies, pits that overflowed or were long neglected. His competitors accused him of bribing gatekeepers at lay stalls to dump first, securing fresher routes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was profitable. There were even class differences among gong farmers themselves. Apprentice-style hierarchies emerged, with experienced men training newcomers and assigning tasks. The most skilled or longest-serving could avoid the worst parts of the job, scraping out the deepest cesspit corners, and instead managed routes or collected payment. In this way, even within the most despised profession, a form of labor stratification evolved. Call it the privy pyramid. Their knowledge also became a kind of power. Gong farmers knew, quite literally, the underbelly of the city. They knew which homes produced excessive waste, a mark of wealth, which inns dumped illegally, and which neighborhoods neglected their sanitation duties. When outbreaks of dysentery or plague struck, city officials sometimes turned to these men to identify hot zones. Their informal maps of cesspits and waste flows became proto-data, shaping the early understanding of urban hygiene. There's even a notable incident during the 1517 Evil May Day riots in London, when foreign merchants were attacked by angry citizens. In the unrest that followed, several neighborhoods were blocked off, not by soldiers, but by waste cart operators and gong farmers, who strategically clogged narrow alleyways with refuse carts, effectively quarantining rioters and preventing spread. A strange, accidental act of crowd control powered by human waste. And so we must ask, were gong farmers powerless? Perhaps not. They wielded an invisible form of influence, socially shunned yet materially necessary. The very nature of their work made them marginal, but their function made them central to public health, agriculture, and urban planning. Even the language they left behind has survived. The term night soil persisted well into the 19th century. In Victorian times, echoes of the gong farmers' work lived on in the dustmen and nightmen of London. Their tools, a wide-brimmed hat, thick gloves, and a reinforced bucket, changed little for centuries. Some even say that early civil engineers, when designing the first modern sewer systems under Sir Joseph Bazalgette in the 1850s, consulted descendants of these men for guidance. And yet, despite all this, they remain mostly absent from popular memory. No statues commemorate them. No stained glass in cathedrals shows them at work. But in their quiet persistence, their willingness to shoulder society's most unpleasant burden, gong farmers became unlikely agents of resilience. They kept towns livable, they enabled growth, they fertilized fields, and occasionally they transcended their station. But here's the question history leaves us with. In a profession so universally despised, so shunned by polite company, what was the private life of a gong farmer really like? What did they talk about over supper? Who married them? What were their dreams, if they even dared to dream beyond the pit? So far, we've walked through the fetid passageways and half-lit alleys of medieval sanitation. We've peered into the night soil trade, learned of secret economies fertilized by human waste, and followed the rare path of upward mobility for the otherwise untouchable gong farmer. But every story in history has its sunset, even the one told by candlelight from beneath a castle's privy. In this final section, we explore the slow decline of the gong farmer's trade, the social forces that made them obsolete, and what traces, if any, they left behind in our modern understanding of hygiene, labor, and civic life. Let's begin in the 17th century, when cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam swelled far beyond the capabilities of medieval sanitation systems. Gong farmers were still at work, trudging through side alleys with their iron-bound buckets and horse-drawn wagons, but their efforts were increasingly futile. Tenements now soared 3 or even 4 stories high, each level with its own latrine draining into pits beneath or behind the building. These cesspits overflowed faster than ever, and no number of buckets could keep pace. The real turning point came not from a reformer or a royal decree, but from an engineer and an inventor, Sir John Harington and Alexander Cumming, who are credited respectively with designing early versions of the flush toilet. Harrington's 1596 prototype for Queen Elizabeth. I was more curiosity than revolution, but by the 18th century, the idea of a water-based waste removal system began to take serious hold. It was not yet widespread. It required plumbing infrastructure. No city yet possessed, but the seed had been planted. Flush toilets were, at first, exclusive to the wealthy. Their function relied not only on craftsmanship, but on access to clean water, which was itself a luxury. Even so, the dream of removing human waste from sight and smell with the pull of a lever appealed to all classes. Gong farmers may have been reliable, but they were visible, and to a society increasingly obsessed with appearances, the mere thought of someone physically handling feces began to seem not just unsavory, but uncivilized. In parallel, the industrial revolution transformed urban life. More people flooded into cities in search of factory work. Population density exploded, particularly in places like Manchester, Birmingham, and East London. With this growth came cholera epidemics, terrifying and swift. In 1832, the disease swept through cities, killing thousands within days. At the our time, medical understanding was still clouded by the miasma theory, the belief that foul air caused disease. Although incorrect, this belief further stigmatized the presence of night soil and its handlers. City officials began to act. In 1848, the British government passed the Public Health Act, which gave local authorities the power to implement sanitation measures. This led to an explosion of interest in underground sewer systems, including the work of Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who in the 1850s and 1860s engineered a vast network of sewers beneath London that would finally render cesspits obsolete. With them, the Gong farmers' role rapidly diminished. It was not an immediate extinction. In poorer districts and in rural villages, cesspits and privies continued to operate into the early 20th century. Night soil collection, though no longer performed by Gong farmers per se, was carried out by nightmen, often employed by local councils. The work was slightly more professionalized but no less grim. Reports from 1890s Sheffield describe municipal workers being supplied with rubber gloves, breathing cloth soaked in vinegar, and wooden carts sealed with pitch. In some rural corners of Europe and Asia, similar professions still exist to this day. And yet, the very invisibility of modern sanitation means we rarely think about the transition. Sewers whisk away waste with the magic of gravity and engineering. Trucks empty septic tanks with the turn of a pump. We no longer see the face of the person managing our refuse. And maybe that's what the Gong farmers' legacy really is, a vanishing. Still, history has a peculiar way of preserving even its most unpleasant corners. Occasionally, builders and archaeologists stumble upon soil layers, thick deposits beneath old cities composed of centuries of human waste. These layers, often rich with organic matter, sometimes contain preserved objects, broken pottery, discarded utensils, coins, buttons. Every so often, something stranger emerges, a shoe sole, a child's doll, or even skeletal remains. Cesspits, in their own grim way, became time capsules. From these finds, researchers reconstruct the diets, habits, and health of medieval populations. Pollen grains tell us what plants grew nearby. Parasite eggs tell us about disease prevalence. Seeds and nutshells show what people ate, and perhaps even what they couldn't digest. All this comes from pits once cleaned by anonymous men with shovels and cartwheels. They are the unwanted stewards of a civilization's waste, and now, curiously, its memories. The linguistic remains are subtler but present. Phrases like waste not, want not, or the use of gong as a euphemism in children's language may echo the shadow of the trade. In some dialects, particularly in northern England, gong still refers to waste or refuse. Place names, like Laystall Street, Dung Wharf, and Nightsoil Lane, still mark old city maps, even if residents today are unaware of their origins. But what about the personal lives of these men? That question is more difficult to answer. Gong farmers, like many medieval laborers, did not leave behind letters, journals, or family chronicles. Their voices are absent in the archives. We know only what others said about them, usually clerks, magistrates, or satirists. But through these fragments, a picture emerges. Most Gong farmers were married, contrary to the myth of isolation. In fact, some records suggest that wives or older sons helped with the trade. They lived on the margins of town, often near the rivers or dump sites they serviced. They were often hired by the job, not the hour, which gave them some control over their schedules. This autonomy, while far from luxurious, was valuable in a world of rigid hierarchy. They were not literate, most likely. They were not celebrated, but they endured. And in enduring, they performed one of the most basic and vital functions of human civilization, the maintenance of cleanliness amid squalor, order amid chaos. So what do we take from this story? That survival, even in the filthiest corners of society, can hold dignity. That even a life spent in muck can create opportunity. That history's great cities were not only built by kings and masons, but by those who carried the waste away so the rest could flourish. That the lowest job can still be a pillar in the structure of something grand. And in today's world, where sanitation is taken for granted and waste is whisked away by silent machines, it's worth remembering the hands that once did that work, night after night, with a shovel, a torch, and a thick cloth over their mouth. So the next time you flush a toilet or see a sanitation truck on its rounds, ask yourself, who keeps the city clean while the rest of us sleep? Story 2, How to Survive a Siege. Lessons from a baker in 1574, Leiden. You are standing in the Dutch city of Leiden. The year is 1574. The streets are narrow, the canals are lined with windmills, and every step echoes against tall, timber-framed houses. Beneath your feet, the cobblestones are damp with recent rain, and above you, clouds churn in the gray spring sky. But today, something feels different. There is a tension in the air, something coming closer, heavier than the usual tides of commerce or gossip. You are a baker, and you know what's coming. War. Not war as it's often told, not gleaming. Armor or triumphant charges. No banners, no brass. Just the silent approach of enemy troops, the slow tightening of the noose around the city, and the gnawing realization that there is nowhere to run. This is the Siege of Leiden, one of the pivotal moments in the 80 years. War, when the rebellious Dutch provinces fought for independence from Spanish rule. It is a conflict of brutal persistence, where cities become pawns and starvation is a weapon more feared than swords. The Spanish army, led by Francisco de Valdez, had already captured surrounding towns. They were seasoned in siege warfare and understood its slow, deliberate cruelty. Leiden, important, rebellious, Protestant, was now in their sights. The Dutch resistance, backed by William of Orange, was scattered and weakened. The city was not ready. As a baker, your life until now has followed a steady rhythm. Waking before dawn, kneading dough by firelight, measuring flour with trained instinct. Your world is bounded by yeast, oven, and morning cues. But all that is disrupted when the gates are shut and the siege begins. At first, life continues with tense normality. The bakeries keep running and citizens ration their food. City officials assure residents that relief is coming. The Bakers' Guild, though, now limited in supplies, is ordered to continue production of bread using existing grain stores. But grain is limited, and within weeks, prices rise. In a detailed city record from early June 1574, we read that the price of rye doubled in a matter of days. Bakers began mixing in substitute ingredients: peas, beans, even powdered acorns. You do the same, experimenting with whatever keeps the loaves together. It works for now. The bread is dense, heavy, bitter. but it keeps people alive. As the siege stretches on, food becomes the measure of everything: loyalty, desperation, survival. The city officials impose rations. You are given daily quotas. Anyone caught hoarding grain is punished. Neighbors turn on each other. One day, a crowd gathers outside a rival baker's shop, accusing him of concealing flour. His windows are smashed. You learn not to draw attention. You keep your head down, hands floured, oven hot, but nothing lasts. By July, the Spanish have completely encircled the city. Supplies stop. No one enters or leaves. The canals, which once brought fish and trade, now carry only rumors. The windmills cease their turning. Fires are fueled with broken furniture. The hunger worsens. With no more wheat or rye, you and the other bakers are ordered to shut down. You are issued a new role, distributing gruel prepared by the city council. This siege soup is made from boiled weeds, grass, and whatever else can be scraped together. Even this becomes rare. Diaries from inside Leiden tell of terrible sights. Dogs vanish first, then cats. Rats are hunted. Leather shoes are boiled and chewed. One woman is recorded as having boiled her linen undergarments in broth and claimed they were better than cabbage. There is no salt, no butter, no milk, and for the first time in your life, no bread. You try to maintain your routines. Each morning, you check the empty flour bins. You clean your oven, even though it has nothing to bake. The act of working keeps your mind from unraveling. In some ways, it's the bakers who remain the most mentally intact, having survived years of precise repetition and discipline. Others are not so lucky. Disease spreads. Weakened bodies fall to fever. Gravediggers cannot keep pace. The bell tolls hourly. Then comes the proposal, controversial, desperate, possibly treasonous. A group of Dutch leaders suggests breaching the dikes. If the land is flooded, the Spanish cannot maintain their siege. The idea is both brilliant and dangerous. To save the city, drown the land around it. Farms, homes, even entire villages will be lost. But water might be Leiden's salvation. You, like many citizens, are not consulted. You only hear whispers. Some think it madness. Others say it is providence. Either way, it's not your choice. August arrives, and with it, a terrible calm. The Spanish seem dug in. No ships come. Relief feels like a myth. On your street, one family dies in a single night. You help carry out the bodies. No ceremony. Just silence. In September, the flood comes. Dutch forces, led by William of Orange, break the dikes. Slowly, the water creeps across the land. Insects swarm, homes vanish, crops rot. And the Spanish, so confident, so methodical, are suddenly flailing. Their camps are soaked, their horses bogged down, their cannons mired. The water is rising, and with it, a sliver of hope. The Dutch Navy sends in flat-bottomed boats, the legendary sea beggars, who navigate the flooded landscape like ghosts. They bring weapons, some food, encouragement. Still, the water is slow, and the famine continues. You grow weaker. Your hands tremble when you try to stir a pot. Your neighbors no longer speak, conserving energy with silence. But then, on the morning of October 3rd, 1574, something happens. The Spanish are gone. They fled in the night, abandoning the siege. Boats arrive. Soldiers disembark. And with them, barrels of bread and herring. You weep bread. Real bread. For the first time in months, you feel the warmth of a loaf in your hand, the softness of crumb, the scent that once defined your life. People laugh, cry. Some cannot chew. Their jaws have forgotten the motion. You help distribute the loaves. To this day, October 3rd is celebrated in Leiden with free bread and herring in honor of that impossible moment. But as you sit on the stone, steps of your shop, bread in hand, another question comes. You've survived. But what now? What becomes of a city that's eaten its pets, boiled its shoes, and drowned its land to save itself? When the siege ends, silence lingers. You, the baker who once measured mornings in ounces of rye and wood ash, now measure them in sounds. The distant creak of a boat returning to port, the rustling of neighbors stepping outside without fear. No alarms, no cannon fire, no scratching at cellar doors, just the eerie stillness of a city that survived by holding its breath. On October 3, 1574, after 4 months of starvation and isolation, the Spanish siege was finally broken. The cause: water. William of Orange's daring strategy of breaching the dikes and flooding the countryside worked. The invading army, unable to maintain footing in the rising waters, withdrew. The sea beggars, Dutch rebels in flat-bottomed boats, brought food and freedom in equal measure. The first loaves of bread and herring are remembered as symbols of liberation. But the real work began the next day. Leiden was no longer a functioning city. It was, by most accounts, a skeleton. Thousands had died, some say up to a third of the population. Houses stood empty. Businesses had shuttered, fields were drowned. Infrastructure, like the city's drainage and market routes, had collapsed under both famine and flood. And for you, a baker, the return to normal is anything but. Your ovens are intact, though choked with soot and ash. Your supply bins are empty. Your hands, once precise and practiced, tremble from months of malnutrition. Yet somehow, this is what recovery looks like: a broken, frail beginning. The city council, itself hollowed by the siege, begins issuing emergency decrees. Food distribution continues, now under less frantic but still tightly regulated conditions. Bakers like you are summoned to produce bread again, but with a difference. You are now part of a public rebuilding project, not a private business. Your baking for now is not for profit. It is for survival. Flour is imported from nearby towns. Boats bring barley, wheat, and rye. But the people's digestive systems, still fragile from months of starvation and desperate improvisation, cannot handle rich food immediately. The city physician issues warnings: eat slowly, chew carefully, drink water between bites. A strange form of rationing continues, not from scarcity, but from recovery. In the first weeks, many people become ill not from famine, but from eating too quickly. Bread, once a danger from its absence, is now a danger from its abundance. You adjust your baking accordingly. You bake lighter loaves with higher water content, experiment with oat cakes, and even collaborate with local brewers for spent grain. You are not just feeding the city, you are teaching it how to eat again. The Dutch authorities, grateful for the city's resistance, offer something extraordinary in return: a university. This is perhaps the most lasting and least expected result of the siege. In 1575, William of Orange grants Leiden the right to establish a university in recognition of its endurance. Leiden University becomes the first in the northern Netherlands, a reward not of gold or land, but of learning. The contrast is striking. A city that weeks before had chewed its own belts is now planning libraries and lecture halls. You are no scholar, but you do notice the change. Students arrive, filling inns and taverns. Latin words drift through the streets. A printmaker opens shop 2 doors down from your bakery, selling pamphlets on theology and politics. You learn to bake sweet, rolls for scholars, some of whom pay in books or ink. The university brings more than ideas. It brings money, prestige, and a new identity. Leiden is no longer just a city that survived. It is now a city of thought. But the scars of the siege do not vanish. You still pass doorways marked with charcoal crosses, homes where no one returned. You still see vacant lots where entire families once lived. The graveyards are fuller, the birth rate is slower. And the trauma, though unspoken, shapes every decision. The Bakers' Guild reconvenes with fewer members. New laws are passed to regulate grain reserves, so the city is never again so vulnerable. You are elected to a local committee, not for your literacy, which you never learned, but for your reliability. A strange reward for staying alive. As the months pass, life does normalize. Markets return, children play, weddings resume. Yet there is a subtle shift in how people value food. Before the siege, bread was often taken for granted. Now each loaf carries weight, not just in sustenance, but in memory. You notice this especially around October each year. People begin placing loaves on doorsteps, handing out herring to strangers, gathering in the town square not in grief, but in recognition, a quiet gratitude. By 1580, Leiden is a different city. Rebuilt, yes, but not as it was before. Its identity is forged not from conquest or conquest avoided, but from endurance. And that endurance lives in small things, in how people plant their gardens, in how they preserve leftovers, in how they never ever forget to thank the baker. You, too, are changed. You no longer measure your work in coin alone. You teach your apprentice not just how to bake, but why to bake. Why precision matters, why timing counts, why even stale bread has a role in a city's survival. And yet, as you pass the alleyways where people once boiled shoe leather, you ask yourself something else. Could it happen again? Could we be surrounded once more, starved into desperation? What lessons would we remember, and which would we forget? You've lived through it. The siege, the famine, the recovery. Now years have passed. It is the early 1600s, and you are older. Your hands more knotted, your beard touched with gray flour dust. Your shop still stands on a narrow canal in Leiden, though the building behind it has been rebuilt twice. The streets bustle again. You hear laughter, arguments, the clip of hooves, the creak of overloaded carts. Leiden has grown. So has its university. So have your apprentices, 3 of them now, all born after the siege and eager to shape dough, without knowing what it meant to shape it under siege. You wake before dawn, just as you did then. You stoke the ovens, weigh the flour, shape the loaves. The difference now lies in the silence behind the motions. In 1574, each step was an act of resistance. Now, it's routine. But even in routine, you remember. Leiden did not forget either. Each year, on the 3rd of October, the city observes Leiden's onset, the Relief of Leiden. It is not a festival marked by military parades or triumphal arches. Instead, it is observed with bread and herring, handed out freely to anyone who asks, not in luxury, but in symbolism. A simple fish, a plain loaf, a reminder of hunger and of the hands that fed others when there was barely enough to live. In some years, the observance is somber. In others, celebratory. Children wear garlands. Sermons are given. Some citizens recite the names of the dead from 1574, as if reading from sacred scripture. Others simply stand in the market square, eyes closed, remembering. You attend always, though never at the center. You stand with the tradesmen. You help distribute rolls baked from a traditional recipe: barley, rye, and a touch of brewer's yeast. The city officials have asked you many times to speak during the ceremonies. You've always declined. You've seen what happens when history is polished too smooth, and you remember things others prefer not to. The fights over moldy crusts, the baby who starved beside her mother, the man who was found roasting, a cat over coals, and the woman who traded her wedding ring for a single onion. The silence of the bakeries when flour ran out. History, you believe, lives in these memories just as much as in victory speeches or city charters. There is a small museum being built near the university, dedicated to the siege. One of your apprentices, now a grown man, offers to donate your flour scales, the long-handled peel you used to tend the fire, and the wooden trough where you kneaded emergency loaves during those lean weeks. You hesitate, not because you're sentimental, but because you wonder, will people understand what these objects meant? A trough is just wood. A peel is just a tool. But during the siege, they were lifelines. Could a museum convey that? Still, you allow it. Let the future decide. The city changes faster now. The dikes have been reinforced, and new windmills power flour mills at speeds your younger self could never have imagined. Trade flows through Leiden's canals, connecting it to cities like Amsterdam, Hamburg, even London. Scholars debate philosophy over wine and roasted duck. Few remember that this city was nearly erased by starvation, disease, and silence. But you remember. One morning, after a stormy night, your roof leaks. You climb the ladder to inspect it and spot a crack in the tiles. As you lean forward, something catches your eye on the far edge of the rooftop. A soot-blackened beam, still charred from the fires of 1574. It is the only part of the original roof that remains. You trace your hand over the beam, rough, cracked, but strong. Later that day, you make a note in your ledger, not about profits or flour prices, but about that beam. You write, still here, still bearing weight. You think about what else remains, the lessons in storing food properly, the need for public infrastructure, like grain warehouses and water sanitation, the importance of local governance that listens in times of crisis, not just commands, and perhaps, most of all, the slow-burning power of collective endurance. The Siege of Leiden is remembered today not because it was extraordinary in strategy, it wasn't, nor because it was decisive in battle. Leiden was not where the war ended. It is remembered because a city, hungry and surrounded, refused to surrender. It starved, it suffered, and it survived. And in doing so, it carved its place into the fabric of Dutch resistance. As you sit in your shop's back room, watching the young apprentice sweep the floor with the same strokes you used 50 years ago, you smile faintly. He doesn't know what this city once did with stale bread and weeds. But he knows how to knead, and maybe that's enough. Perhaps you think history is not just what we write, but what we pass on quietly, hand to hand, like a warm loaf in cold fingers. And so, you ask yourself one last question. If the walls closed, in again, if silence returned, would we remember how to feed each other, how to endure, how to rise again, even from flour and ash? Story 3. The bureaucrat who filed too much. Inside the secret world of 18th century paperwork. If you had lived in Vienna in the 1770s, you might have imagined the Habsburg Empire as a stage of grandeur. Emperors in gilded halls, powdered wigs. Beneath chandeliers, orchestras tuning their instruments in great stone palaces. But behind that velvet curtain lay the true machinery of empire. Not in military parades or royal proclamations, but in paperwork. Reams upon reams of it. Decrees, receipts, livestock inventories, census forms, permits for window shutters, reports on the price of salt, the maintenance of chimneys, and the movement of goats. Welcome to the world of Anton Lipp, senior copyist, for the Imperial Archives, Department of Internal Records and Rural Assessments. Title long enough? So was his job. Anton was not a famous man. You will not find his name in textbooks or his portrait in museums. But from his cramped desk beneath, the rafters of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, he quietly shaped the fabric of imperial life. Not with power, but with ink. Anton arrived at his post in 1769, barely 20 years old, recently trained in Latin shorthand and double-entry bookkeeping. His starting salary, 24 florins per quarter, plus 1 boiled egg per day from the staff. Kitchen, though only if the chicken coop behind the chancery yielded enough. His first task? Transcribe grain reports from rural Bohemia into the central registry. The job description was, in essence, copy, cross-reference, recopy, rebind. Then do it again. You may imagine that such work would be dull. And it was gloriously, relentlessly dull. A typical day began at 6 a.m., when Anton lit a wax candle, or used leftover tallow if supplies ran low, and began his copying. By 8 a.m., his cramped handwriting filled 2 columns of vellum. On the 14th of November, in the village of Novi Gicin, 3 sheaves of barley were unaccounted for. And so on. His ink-stained fingers left smudges on his sleeves. His right thumbnail developed a permanent groove from sharpening quills. But Anton loved it. Where others saw tedium, he saw order. In a world of political unrest and peasant uprisings, Anton believed that bureaucracy was the thread that kept the empire stitched together. And in some small way, he was right. By the late 18th century, the Habsburg Empire, vast, polyglot, and chaotically governed, was under pressure to reform. Empress Maria Theresa and her son Joseph II sought to centralize power and modernize administration. That meant gathering information. Lots of it. Anton was a foot soldier in this paper army. He didn't just copy reports. He categorized them, filed them, cross-referenced them with year-old data. When inconsistencies arose, say a village that reported 86 sheep in spring but 129 in fall, he flagged the discrepancy. This was not idle curiosity. These differences affected tax revenue, grain distribution, and even military provisioning. Paperwork, you see, was not passive. It was power. Joseph II believed that the empire could only function if every subject was known, recorded, and measured. That meant censuses, land surveys, population counts, even moral registers that tallied the number of illegitimate children, taverns, and suspicious foreigners. Anton once spent 6 weeks compiling a list of all the chimney sweeps operating within a 2-mile radius of the city of Linz. His findings led to a tax on sweepers for soot disposal privilege and a minor riot. But that was the nature of bureaucratic work, invisible in its cause, inescapable in its effect. Anton eventually rose to become chief clerical assessor for the Department of Rural Anomalies. The title sounds strange now, but at the time it held significance. He had authority to review documents submitted by local magistrates and ensure they met imperial standards. He could reject forms with inconsistent margins. He once sent back an entire regional harvest report because the entries were inadequately indented. He wielded a red wax seal as if it were a sword. By 1785, the imperial administration had swollen to such a size that a new office was constructed near the Danube to house the growing archive. Anton lobbied to design the filing system himself. Using an innovative accordion fold folio method he developed from watching bookbinders at the local university. His system allowed twice the documents to be stored in half the space. No monument was ever built to commemorate this, yet it improved the efficiency of rural taxation throughout Upper Austria for over 30 years. As Anton aged, he grew slightly paranoid. He feared the loss of data. Fire, rats, or careless young clerks threatened to undo decades of ink. So he began making duplicates, carbon copies before carbon paper, by pressing fresh ink against a damp parchment under glass. It took twice, as long, but Anton insisted. One surviving memo written in 1792 reads, "The empire is not held by swords or crowns, but by quiet hands that write clearly and file correctly. It is unsigned but unmistakably his." And yet Anton never married. He had no children. He died in 1801 of a lung infection, likely caused by mold spores from damp paper in the basement archives. His death warranted no formal announcement, just a brief note in the staff ledger. Herr Lipp, deceased, position to be reviewed. But years later, when Napoleon's armies stormed Vienna and many imperial records were seized or destroyed, the back archive building where Anton had stored his files was untouched, locked, forgotten, too boring to loot. It was rediscovered. In 1823, entire decades of rural census records, tax logs, livestock counts, and grain tallies, meticulously preserved in Anton's handwriting, were used to rebuild the empire's administrative base after the wars. Anton never led armies. He never wrote philosophy, but he filed and filed well. Still, one can't help but wonder, what becomes of a man who lives in documents? Did Anton ever question the empire he so carefully served? Or was his world truly no larger than the paper on his desk? The office where Anton Lipp spent most of his life was not one of elegance or power. It smelled faintly of glue, mildew, and scorched oil from the ever-smoking lamps. The wooden floorboards creaked with the weight of history, or perhaps just the weight of ledgers which lined every wall, stacked by quarter, by district, by ministry. Anton's desk stood near a leaking window that faced nothing in particular, just a crumbling courtyard with a broken fountain and a tree stump where a lime tree once grew. But from this unremarkable place, Anton performed what he believed was sacred labor. By the 1780s, Anton had copied, cross-checked, and archived over 6,000 separate documents. His handwriting, narrow and precise, had become instantly recognizable to his colleagues. So much so that, unofficially, clerks referred to a particularly detailed form as a lip work. His standard became law. You might think he found solace in this precision, and for a while he did. But over time, even Anton began to feel the creep of doubt. It began with a sheep census. The 1783 Livestock Quantification Project was one of Joseph II's more ambitious schemes. Every sheep, cow, pig, and goat in the empire was to be counted. The goal was agricultural reform and fairer taxation. But the paperwork poured in unevenly. Some villages inflated numbers to receive more subsidies. Others underreported to avoid taxes. Anton began noticing the irregularities. He wrote to a regional inspector, "I must inquire whether the village of Kleindorf indeed sustains 712 goats. This would imply more goats than citizens. No reply came. Instead, new forms arrived. More goats, more inconsistencies, villages with no reported births in 5 years, yet mysteriously growing populations. Entire districts submitted identical figures 2 years in a row, down to the decimal. It began to dawn on Anton. The system was being gamed. His work had never been glamorous, but it had always felt necessary. Now he questioned its meaning. What was the purpose of record keeping if the records themselves became fiction? He began annotating forms in the margins with small, cryptic marks, an asterisk here, a bent line there. His own private code for likely false, duplicated, review needed. He never told anyone. These marks were not official, but they mattered to him. Then came the 1790 decree, signed by Joseph II shortly before his death, requiring all citizens of the empire to be recorded by name, profession, and confessional status. It was to be a true pan-imperial census, a document that would finally unify the patchwork empire into a legible, governable whole. Anton was appointed to oversee the Upper Austria records, one of the largest and most politically sensitive regions in the empire. He took the task seriously, traveling for the first time in 20 years. He visited local chancelleries, inspected storage conditions, spoke with scribes and village priests. What he found was illuminating and deeply troubling. In Nye, some towns' records were burned during peasant revolts. In others, they were rewritten to favor certain landowners. In one chilling case, he discovered entire hamlets unrecorded, left off the rolls due to old feuds or clerical laziness. These people were legally invisible. Anton returned to Vienna with a leather satchel full of papers, maps, and a growing sense of unease. His world, once ruled by ruled lines and ink pots, now felt uncertain. He wrote a report, 60 pages, on the flaws in the census. He included recommendations for verification protocols, independent audits, and standard forms for rural clergy. His supervisor glanced over it, nodded, and shelved it without comment. And the project proceeded, unchanged. Anton was not demoted. He was not punished. He was simply ignored. And yet, he continued his work. Why? Because despite everything, despite the lies, the indifference, the dust, he believed in paper. He believed in the potential of a world properly recorded, measured, and known. He understood that bureaucracy was not about perfection, but persistence. To file a document, in Anton's mind, was to say, this happened. To ink a name was to say, this person existed. Even if no one ever read it again, the act mattered, but it also came with a weight, a burden few recognized. In his later years, Anton often worked by lamplight well past midnight, not because he was required to, but because he feared what might happen if he stopped. Whole communities depended on records to prove land rights, citizenship, and tax exemptions. If one ledger was misfiled, a family might lose their farm. If a census was inaccurate, a village could be denied food during winter. He began keeping a second set of files at home, just in case. He called it his parallel archive, stored in wooden chests beneath his floorboards. It was unofficial, potentially illegal. But it was more complete than anything held in the chancery. This secret collection included letters from minor officials, missing pages from censuses, original copies of revised tax logs, the ghost ledger of a paper empire. One day in 1796, a great flood swamped the lower offices. Many records were destroyed, but Anton, calm as ever, retrieved dry versions from his hidden files. The head archivist, stunned, asked how he had duplicates. Anton simply said, "I knew someone would need them." By the end of his life, Anton had stopped writing reports. Instead, he wrote notations, quiet observations, inserted between lines, of figures, barely legible, written in pencil. How many of these births were ever celebrated? What lies beneath these numbers? Who remembers the names I write? He began to sense that he too might be forgotten, that the thousands of forms he had copied, sorted, and sealed might one day become meaningless. And yet he wrote, Not because it would be read, but because it deserved to be written, which leaves us with a haunting question. If no one reads the documents, if the papers fade and the ink runs, what remains of a life spent recording lives? By 1800, Anton Lipp had become a fixture of the imperial chancery, much like the oil stains on the archive walls or the ever-creaking door to the vault. He was 60 years old, and though no formal retirement age existed for his post, whispers began to circulate that a younger man should take over. Anton, however, remained, quietly refusing to acknowledge the suggestion. His signature, though more jagged, still held authority. His pencil notations still appeared in margins, and his narrow, looping handwriting still ran in long, uninterrupted lines through thick folios of livestock records, legal disputes, and harvest reports. He lived alone in a modest apartment above a tannery near the Salzgries district. The air always smelled faintly of hides, but he liked it. The window faced east, allowing the morning sun to shine through and illuminate his personal desk, where he kept a small stack of unbound parchment, a quill holder, and a candle stub always, waiting to be relit. But his greatest possession was stored beneath the floorboards, the parallel archive. In the quiet years of his life, Anton began organizing it as though someone, someday, might come looking. Each box was labeled in his precise script: Rural Irregularities, 1775-1782, Unfiled Decrees, Provincial, Non-Sanctioned, Clerical Errors of Note, Personal, False Reports, Suspected Fabrication. The records in these boxes had no official standing, but they held truth, the kind that rarely survives in state documents. Anton had preserved notes scribbled by frustrated village priests, corrections from honest tacksmen, desperate appeals from peasants whose names had been misspelled or left off a census. In these scraps lay the lives of people who otherwise would have vanished into the bureaucratic void. He added notes, too. Not for any audience, but perhaps for you, or someone like you. This child was recorded as born on the 29th of February, 1781. There was no such date. The handwriting changes midway. Was there a death in the family? A dozen widows are listed here with no addresses. Where did they go? These reflections were brief. Often they raised questions that could never be answered. But that wasn't the point. They bore witness. Anton did not live to see the 19th century. In early 1801, during a particularly damp winter, he contracted what was then called a chest sickness, likely mold-related pneumonia. He was found at his desk by a junior clerk, still upright, his right hand gripping a quill that had long run. Dry. There was no funeral, just a brief note in the Chancery ledger. Herr Anton Lipp deceased. Desk cleared, files to be reassigned. His belongings were boxed. Most were discarded or reused. His official papers remained in the archive, but the parallel archive, hidden beneath his apartment floor, went unnoticed. For years, decades passed. Wars came, maps changed. The empire crumbled, reformed, crumbled again. And then, in 1874, during a renovation of old tenements in Vienna's inner district, workers pried up warped floorboards and found dozens of wooden boxes, stacked tightly, labeled in fading ink. At first, the boxes were dismissed, just more old papers. But a clerk from the new Municipal Office of Records saw the labels and recognized their significance. He opened one. Inside were the complete original field reports of the failed 1783 sheep census, including annotated discrepancies that explained inconsistencies which had long puzzled historians. Other boxes held letters from minor, regional officials whose decisions had shaped border disputes, agricultural reforms, even the spread of typhus in Bohemia. These were not grand documents, but they filled in the gaps. They connected dots that had once seemed unrelated. They made the past visible, not in marble or gold, but in pencil and parchment. The boxes were transferred to the Vienna City Historical Archive, where they remain today, in a climate-controlled room labeled Lipp Collection. To this day, researchers consult Anton's parallel archive, not for tales of emperors or treaties, but for the texture of real life. His notations, the questions he scrawled in the margins, are sometimes the only surviving commentaries on obscure events. He was never celebrated in his lifetime. But posthumously, Anton Lipp became a foundational figure in the study of administrative archaeology. the uncovering of forgotten records that explain how people actually lived, worked, lied, and hoped within the machinery of empire. His story is not one of heroism, rebellion, or genius. It is the story of persistence, of a man who believed that what was written mattered, even if it was never read. And in that, there is a kind of immortality, because paper fades, ink bleeds, empires collapse. But somewhere, in a gray archive beneath flickering lights, a dusty folder remains, still bearing the tiny looping signature of A. Lip. A quiet reminder that every recorded life, no matter how small, is a defiance of forgetting. Story 4. The monks who brewed in silence, a slow fermentation of faith and ale. If you had wandered into the hills of southern Belgium sometime in the early 18th century, you might have noticed a walled enclosure between two wooded ridgelines, a cluster of stone buildings arranged like a quiet, forgotten village. Smoke curled slowly from one chimney. A small chapel bell tolled just before dawn, and beyond the walls, fields of barley and bitter hops swayed in the wind, grown for a purpose both sacred and peculiar. Inside, the only sound was the scrape of sandals on stone and the occasional soft clinking of glass. These were the monks of Saint-Remacle-en-Bois, an obscure offshoot of the Cistercian order, who had not spoken aloud during daylight hours in nearly 40 years. But their silence was not emptiness, it was fermentation. These monks were brewers. Careful, methodical, patient brewers. And though they uttered no words during their daily work, each gesture, each ladle stirred, each kettle scrubbed, each cask sealed, spoke of an enduring theological conviction that the divine could be understood, not only through prayer, but through process. Their beer, a cloudy, slightly bitter ale known as Bière de la Forêt, was never sold commercially. It was brewed for visitors, pilgrims, and the monastic community itself. And yet, travelers came from hundreds of miles to taste it, though few ever met the brewers themselves, because to brew in silence was to brew with intent. Let us step into the year 1712. The monastery was entering its 7th decade of brewing. Its founder, a prior named Brother Mathieu, had been long dead. But his original brewing manual, a handwritten tome bound in buckskin and stored in a locked cedar case, remained the centerpiece of the monastic library. Every young monk studied it during novitiate training. The manual was titled simply Opus Fermentandi. It began not with instructions, but a prayer. O Lord, who turned water into wine and bitterness into mercy, grant us the patience to wait for thy bubbles. Unlike the monastic brewers of later fame, such as the Trappists, these early Cistercians did not pursue profit. They brewed because they believed fermentation was a mirror of spiritual life. You began with disorder, crushed grain, scalded water, wild yeast. Then you waited, watched, believed, and eventually, something new emerged, something alive. The brewery itself was a long, low building set into the southern wall of the monastery. The stone was cool in summer and frigid in winter, ideal for slow brewing. Inside were 2 copper kettles, one inherited from a disbanded priory in Alsace, and a series of large oak barrels darkened by age and use. Each monk was assigned to a station. Brother Eligius, a man of 71 with a curved spine and enormous forearms, oversaw the mashing process. He stirred the mash tun with a wooden oar nearly as tall as he was, never once deviating from the 32-minute stirring cycle. Brother Amandus, younger and prone to nosebleeds, tended the yeast cultures. He kept 6 varieties alive and small, earthen crocks, feeding them flour paste and whispering the psalms while he worked. No one heard him, but he whispered anyway. Brother Moore, the silent cellarer, managed the temperature logs. Every day he measured the ambient air and wort temperatures with a mercury thermometer, imported at great expense from Liège, and recorded them in a narrow notebook. He had done this for 29 years, using the same stub of graphite. Each notebook bore his initials and a Roman numeral. By 1712, he had reached Morris 17th, but it wasn't all solemnity. There were small joys, rituals carried out with deep reverence and quiet smiles. On the day of the first boil, the monks processed into the brewery holding juniper branches. No one knew why anymore. It was simply tradition. On bottling day, they wore white aprons embroidered with green thread. And during the final tasting before storage, they tapped their wooden cups together 3 times before drinking. 3 taps. Always 3. For Father, Son, and Spirit. Or perhaps for grain, yeast, and time. The beer itself was unfiltered, heavy, and slightly sour, flavored with local herbs like sweet woodruff and yarrow. It tasted of moss and earth, with a faint warmth at the finish. It was not fashionable. It was not consistent, but it was, by all reports, unforgettable. Still, the monks never spoke of it. They believed in what the rule of Saint Benedict called ora et labora, prayer and work. Brewing was not a craft, not an art, not even a trade. It was labor in the service of the divine. Their silence was an offering. Their patience, a kind of devotion. But in the wider world, things were shifting. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht redrew European borders. Nearby towns fell under new taxation systems. Trade routes altered, and with the increase of excise taxes on alcohol in the Austrian Netherlands, even monasteries felt the pinch. The Bishop of Namur sent a letter requesting that Saint-Remacle-en-Bois begin selling its beer commercially to help support the diocese's debts. The abbot, a frail and nearly blind man named Dom Theodoric, wrote a reply in Latin. It read simply, Nostrum silentium pretium non habet. Our silence has no price. But pressure mounted. A second letter arrived, this time suggesting that monks were hoarding resources and failing in Christian charity. The suggestion, if the monks would not sell, perhaps the beer should be taxed in kind, or worse, seized. The brewing continued, but the casks were now counted. The visitors watched more closely. Rumors spread that the recipe was being hidden for political reasons. Brother Eligius stirred with a heavier hand. Brother Amandus began weeping at night. Brother Maur drew a dark line through his temperature logs, then began again. In the cloister, garden, the hops were turning yellow. It was nearly harvest, but a new kind of fermentation had begun, not of beer, but of tension. And so we end this first section with a quiet but pressing question. When devotion meets bureaucracy, when silence meets taxation, what begins to unravel first? The beer or the brotherhood? The autumn of 1713 arrived with damp, leaves, fog-bound mornings, and unwelcome guests. A newly appointed diocesan auditor named Father Rupertus appeared at the gates of Saint-Remacle-en-Bois in late October, sent by the Bishop of Namur, to assess monastic contributions to diocesan coffers. He was accompanied by a clerk, 2 ledgers, and a polite but permanent cough. He asked no permission before entering the enclosure. He spoke constantly. The monks, bound to silence, could not reply. To Father Rupertus, the silent brewery seemed suspect. Why refuse to speak? Why brew such quantities of ale without selling it? Why the careful records, the ledger books full of notations, the locked cellar? Was this not commerce disguised as piety? He did not understand that silence was their language. For the next several weeks, he sat at a carved wooden desk in the cloister's eastern gallery, sipping diluted wine and watching the monks at work. His clerk followed the brothers into the brew house, taking inventory with meticulous precision. He counted barley sacks, measured yeast jars, and even poked a stick into the mash to assess moisture content. Brother Eligius, though outwardly compliant, began stirring the mash more vigorously than usual. The steam from the copper kettle clouded his eyes, and once he raised his ladle slightly higher than necessary, splashing Rupertus's clerk with warm wort. The monk offered no apology. He simply kept stirring. For the first time in decades, the abbey's quiet rituals were interrupted. Brother Amandus, unsettled by the intrusion into his yeast chamber, moved his jars to a locked side room beneath the chapel. He labeled the door, Sacrarium, and when Rupertus's clerk attempted to enter, Brother Amandus silently pointed to a painted sign above the lintel, Qui entra non revertitur. He who enters shall not return. It was meant theologically, but the clerk misunderstood and did not return. Rupertus soon made his position clear. The beer must be sold. God's work should not be hoarded, he wrote in his report. If the ale is good, and it is, it should be offered for coin, so the revenue may aid in the upkeep of more deserving parishes. The order has kept its gifts bottled long enough. The abbot, Dom Theodoric, wrote only 3 words in reply. In silentio, speramus. In silence, we hope, but pressure did not relent. By winter, a tax inspector from Namur arrived. He brought papers stamped with official seals, demanding full inventory, daily brewing records, and a complete log of all non-liturgical liquid productions. He did not request entry, he simply entered. That was when Brother Moore stopped, recording temperatures. He closed his final notebook, Morris 68th, and placed it quietly on the cedar shelf beside the brewing manual. He then picked up his graphite stub and began something new. He drew. Not charts, not graphs, but floor plans, pipe routes, the angles of the sun across fermentation casks, a small diagram of how steam condensed on the copper dome of the primary, kettle annotated with notes on time and taste. Each drawing was labeled ADS, meaning ad diem silentium. To God, in silence, Brother Maurer had become the order's unofficial archivist. He knew the rhythm of the brew like breath. His hands remembered where every tool belonged, which cask aged better in which season, which yeast gave a hint of rosemary when cooled at 13 degrees. But now he feared loss, so he documented the intangible. He copied the shape of Brother Eligius's ladle and the exact grain mix ratio in Eligius's handwriting. He collected discarded hop stems and pasted them to parchment with annotations. From the south field, sweeter this year. The monks did not speak, but their response was loud in other ways. They changed nothing in the brew. They sang no protest hymns. They refused no visitors. But they brewed slightly slower, bottled slightly fewer casks. Their silence grew heavier, more deliberate. Meanwhile, the outside world stirred. Merchants from Dinant heard rumors that the silent monks were sitting on barrels of untaxed, unreleased beer. They wrote letters to Rupertus offering contracts. A small wine merchant even sent an unsolicited cart to the gates, expecting to collect a sample cask for evaluation. The cart was left untouched. After 3 days, it was wheeled away, sour and empty. Inside the monastery, something shifted. The abbey's carpenter, Brother Ludo, who had once made only pews and prayer stools, began crafting narrow reinforced barrels, smaller than standard ale casks. He did not explain why. In the brewery, a secret door, long unused, was oiled and unbarred. It led into a stone tunnel, part of the original 14th century foundations. Its original purpose was unclear, perhaps a drainage passage, perhaps a medieval escape route. The monks cleared it of debris and quietly began moving empty casks into the tunnel's cool belly. No one spoke of resistance, but resistance was fermenting. Still, the abbot refused open defiance. He issued only one instruction written in a narrow slip of parchment and passed between brothers. Remember, our voice is the taste. By early spring of 1714, tensions had reached their peak. Father Rupertus returned with a final directive. Within 30 days, the monastery must produce a marketable inventory for sale. Failure to comply would result in the forfeiture of all brewing equipment to diocesan authorities. The monks met that night in the refectory. No words were spoken, but every brother present removed his cowl, folded it on the table, and waited. Even the elderly Brother Eligius, whose back no longer allowed him to kneel, stood upright. Dom Theodoric, too frail to rise from his chair, looked at them with tears in his eyes. He raised one hand, then pointed toward the east corridor, toward the brewing hall, and without sound the monks stood and walked together, returning to the kettles, not to surrender, but to brew one final batch. One for the silence. But what would happen to that final cask? What shape would resistance take in an age of ledgers and tariffs? And would anyone ever taste the prayer buried in the bubbles? Spring 1714 arrived late in the forest of Saint-Remac-l'Ambois. Snow clung to the shaded roots beneath the monastery walls until late March, and the first shoots of barley barely poked through the cold, damp soil by the feast of St. Joseph. But within the monastic walls, something stirred with quiet urgency. The brothers, having received the bishop's final demand, did not argue. They did not write letters. They did not plead. They returned to their kettles and prepared a final brew. It was to be called, though not allowed, Cervisia Ultima. The last. Altwat every detail was intentional. The grain was taken only from the eastern field, where barley grew slower and sweeter. The yeast used was from Brother Amandus's oldest and most temperamental strain, a wild-captured culture stored in a clay amphora since 1691, rarely touched. Hops were added in 3 stages, not 2, for a deeper bitterness. It fermented for 10 days longer than usual, and unlike the standard monastery ale, which was bottled in dark brown clay jugs, this batch was set aside in 7 small oak barrels, each sealed with beeswax and stamped with the monastic seal, a hand raised in blessing beneath a stylized barley stalk. The 7th barrel was different. It bore no stamp. Instead, Brother Mar inscribed a line into the wood, using the same graphite stub he had used for nearly 3 decades. In silentio gustatur Deus. In silence, God is tasted. The brothers carried the 7 barrels into the underground tunnel. There, in the cool stone air beneath the abbey, they placed the casks atop wooden racks and surrounded them with juniper branches, the same branches. They had always used to mark feast days of brewing. Then, they resealed the tunnel. On the day the diocesan officials returned, escorted this time by a delegation of local constables, the monks offered no resistance. They opened the brewhouse doors. They stepped back from their kettles. The copper equipment gleamed from recent polishing, and the stone floors had been scrubbed clean. Rupertus stood at the center of the room and announced that the brewery would now be operated under diocesan management. The monks, he declared, would continue their lives of prayer, while trained laypersons took over production. No monk replied, not even Dom Theodoric, whose eyes were closed in prayer. Or sleep. It was not clear which. Rupertus and his men cataloged the kettles, the barrels, the grain stock. They opened the supply books, noting recent purchases. But when they asked for the recipe, the brothers simply looked toward the cedar, case in the library, where Opus Fermentandi remained locked. Rupertus ordered the case opened. Brother Amandus stepped forward, removed a small iron key from his robe, and placed it on the table. But when Rupertus opened the case, the brewing manual was gone. Only a single slip of parchment remained inside. Nihil hic est nisi memoria. Nothing remains here but memory. That night, Rupertus's men brewed their first batch without monastic aid. They followed scattered notes, copied figures, and guessed at the ratios. The beer they produced was sour, inconsistent, and flat. It lacked the warmth. The breath, they blamed faulty yeast. Meanwhile, the monks continued their silent prayers, but not in the brewhouse. They did not brew again. The kettles were cleaned and left dry, but down below, in the tunnel, the 7 barrels remained. And there, something remarkable happened. In 1715, the monks received an anonymous note left at their gate. It was written, in a fine, sloping hand. It read, "I have tasted your silence. It speaks still." The letter was unsigned, but it was accompanied by a sealed envelope containing a single coin and a wax-stamped document, marked with a crest not of the church, but of the Guild of Brewers in Liège. The seal had been broken and resealed. Inside was a statement of recognition. The undersigned acknowledged that the Bière de la Forêt is of such unique character that its process must not be replicated without the original brewer's will. This is not commerce, it is calling. The coin was not payment. It was a token, a sign of guild respect. Word of the silent monk's ale spread again, this time quietly and with reverence. No one came to buy. No one asked for more. But once a year, on the feast day of St. Benedict, a stranger, never the same person twice, would arrive at the monastery gates with a sealed letter and a request. "May I taste your silence?" Each time, the brothers would descend into the Hoi tunnel. They would draw a cup from the 6th barrel, which was now half empty. The visitor would drink in silence, bow, and depart. No coin was ever exchanged. No records were kept. The 7th barrel, the one inscribed by Brother Moore, was never tapped. It was left untouched. A relic, Dom Theodoric died in 1718. Brother Eligius followed soon after, then Amandus. Brother More lived the longest, passing in 1734, age unknown. His final drawing was of the original mash tun, empty, sunlight slanting through a high window. After that, the brewery was locked. In the centuries that followed, the monastery of Saint-Remacle-en-Bois changed hands many times. It was shuttered during the French Revolution, converted into a stable, then a school, then finally reopened as a Cistercian retreat in the 19th century. But the tunnel remained, and the final barrel, Cervisia Ultima, remained untouched. It is said that in 1924, a German monk serving in the abbey attempted to sample it. The wax seal was broken, but when he tasted the ale, it had turned. All that remained was a faint scent of wood smoke and the barest whisper of yarrow. He resealed the barrel and wrote a single line in the abbey journal. The silence has passed through fermentation and into memory. Today, there are hundreds of monastic breweries around the world. Some are famous, exporting millions of bottles annually. Others remain small, brewing only for the cloister, but none speak quite as loudly as the ones who chose never to speak at all. They remind us of something often overlooked, that even in a world ruled by ledgers, taxes, and tongue, sometimes the yao si, most lasting flavor is not in the ale, but in the act of waiting, of witnessing, of letting things bubble slowly in the dark. And perhaps that is what the monks of Saint-Remacle-en-Bois gave us, not a recipe, not a business, but a lesson that devotion, like fermentation, is quiet, slow, and alive, even when sealed in oak. You would not know it by standing there today, on a flat and lonely strip of salt marsh east of Lincolnshire's coast. But somewhere underfoot lies the ghost of a town called Little Holland. There are no ruins, no half-sunken chapels, no sun-bleached gravestones clinging to dignity, just a gentle sigh of wind over brackish water, a few bent reeds, and a name that only exists on one page of a disintegrating 17th century registry. But Little Holland was once real. For nearly 3 centuries, it clung to the edge of England, a precarious pinprick between marsh and tide. Settled first by Dutch engineers during the reign of Elizabeth I, the town was built not in defiance of the sea, but in delicate partnership with it. It owed its very existence to the careful balance of embankments, drainage channels, and something the Dutch called polderen, a verb that meant to reclaim, but also implied to struggle. And struggle they did. The history of Little Holland begins not in the silt, but in the ambition of landowners. In the late 1500s, Lincolnshire was flush with potential, but cursed with geography. Thousands of acres sat beneath water for most of the year, habitable only to birds and midges. Rich in soil, but poor in promise, these low-lying fens were often written off as God's half-made land. That is, until someone remembered the Dutch. The Low Countries had by then become experts in drainage. Under constant threat from the North Sea, Dutch engineers had turned wetland into farmland with a discipline that bordered on obsession. They dug ditches in grids, built windmills that pumped water upstream, and constructed long clay banks to hold the tide at bay. So, in 1591, a small consortium of English landlords invited a Dutch engineer named Cornelis Vermuyden to visit the fens. He walked the region, studied the soil, noted the behavior of the tide, and declared, perhaps too confidently, that with enough shovels and patience, the land could be made not only dry, but profitable. And so the draining began. Ditches were dug by hand, long, straight, endless ditches, by laborers paid by the inch. Wooden sluices were installed to regulate tidal flow. Willow trees were planted along the dikes to anchor the soil with their greedy roots. The land responded, slowly but surely. And where the sea once lapped at the edges of the salt marsh, a new village emerged, Little Holland. At first, it was only a scattering of thatched roof cottages atop raised mounds, connected by footbridges over drainage ditches. But by 1610, it boasted a chapel, a blacksmith's forge, and an inn called the Tide's Turn. The innkeeper, one Jacob Martin, was himself half Dutch, half English, a product of the strange cultural fusion that the water had demanded. The people of Little Holland lived hard, muddy lives. Summers were dry and dusty, the reclaimed soil cracking into spider webs. Winters were bog wet, the lowlands freezing into sheets of mirror. Most people worked with earth or water, cutting peat, thatching reeds, hauling eels from ditches. But they lived with an ever-present understanding. The sea was not gone. It had simply been paused. The town's church bell was rung not only for services but for floods. When storms surged, the bell tolled 3 times, and every able-bodied resident would rush to the dike walls with shovels and sacks. Children learned to build sand barriers before they could spell. Every adult had a role in the great silent pact between land and sea. For decades, the system held. Then came the spring of 1651. That year, the rains arrived early and did not leave. February brought meltwater from the north, and March delivered storms from the east. The rivers, especially the Witham and the Welland, began to swell beyond their carefully channeled beds. Little Holland's drainage ditches, once praised for their Dutch precision, filled within days. The pumps, operated by weary men and half-broken windmills, could not keep up. The willow trees swayed violently in the rising winds, their anchoring roots now soaked loose. By early April, the lower fields were underwater. Still, the people of Little Holland remained. They had done so before. They raised their footbridges, sealed their doors with wax and clay, and waited. But something was different. It wasn't just the rain or the rivers. It was the sea itself. That spring, the tides came higher than anyone could remember. A strange lunar alignment, later documented by astronomers in Cambridge, had caused an unusually high spring tide to coincide with a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. The North Sea, always looming, seemed to lift itself as if inhaling. The monks of Crowland Abbey, 30 miles inland, recorded the moment in a single grim line. In the 3rd week of Lent, the sea stood upon the land as a king upon his throne. On Sayo. The morning of April 23, 1651, Little Holland vanished. There were no cries for help. No desperate letters. No town bell ringing its threefold warning. Just a long, howling wind through the marsh, and then silence. When relief parties from Boston and Holbeach arrived 3 days later, they found only flotsam, a broken mill paddle, part of a wooden door, and a child's reed toy floating in a ditch. The land where Little Holland had stood was gone, swallowed by the sea and turned once more into salt marsh. No bodies were ever recovered. No buildings remained. It was as if the land had changed its mind. But the question remains, was the flood a natural disaster, or had something been missed, ignored, forgotten in the careful calculus of embankments and tides? Could the tragedy have been prevented? And what became of the memory of a place that simply dissolved? The year is 1673. 22 years have passed since the sea reclaimed Little Holland. In a small room at the back of the Church of St. Botolph, in Boston, Lincolnshire, often called the Stump by locals for its tall, unfinished tower, an old man is hunched over a ledger. His name is Elias Wren, and he is the parish clerk, though he rarely attends services anymore. His eyes are pale, his back curved like an old bow stave, but his mind remains sharp. He is searching for something. In a damp corner of the church's vestry, beneath stacks of baptism records and burial rolls, he has found a collection of old Fens records, loose papers, land grants, handwritten drainage accounts. Among them is a page stained with ink and brine. It is brittle, but readable. On the 11th day of July in the year of our Lord 1637, were surveyed the eastern banks of the Holland marshes. The 3rd weir is compromised. Request made for reinforcement, but reply delayed by landholder G. Hathersley. No action taken as of this entry. Elias closes his eyes. G. Hathersley. The name rings like a cracked bell. Geoffrey Hathersley had been a minor nobleman and investor in the fen drainage projects. Owner of several hundred acres in the southern Holland marshes, he was known less for his engineering skill than for his accounting tricks. He often deferred maintenance on embankments, claiming limited funds or jurisdiction disputes. In 1640, a brief legal case had even accused him of diverting sluice gates to expand his pasture land. The case was dismissed. But now Elias wonders, could that delayed reinforcement in 1637 have set in motion the quiet failure of the seawall that drowned Little Holland? He takes the paper, wraps it in oilcloth, and places it beside another document, a map drawn by a Dutch surveyor in 1615. The map shows a narrow line, faint but present, where the third weir once stood. And behind it, the word Veerland is scribbled in brown ink. Veerland, not Little Holland. That name, it turns out, was never official. Little Holland was a nickname, used by locals and adopted by travelers, but in land records and engineering contracts, the place was listed as Veerland, a Dutch word meaning fairyland or crossing place. Elias flips through the parish records again. There, among a list of marriages recorded in the year 1642, is a single entry, J. Martin, to E. Rolofse of Veerland, married by candlelight due to rain, Jacob Martin, the innkeeper, and his wife, Elsje. That name, Rolofse, appears in no later records, nor does Martin. Their marriage, and their village, disappears beneath the flood, but not entirely. In the archives of Cambridge University, an old folio labeled Hydraulic reports Lincolnshire and Fens, 1600-1700, contains an odd letter dated May 1651. It is unsigned and addressed only to those in authority over water. It reads, "There is more than error in the tide's reclaiming. We built with too much haste and under too much silence. The water keeps count better than man." The writer is unknown, but what follows is a series of crude diagrams showing what we now recognize as subsidence. The drained marsh, once reclaimed, had begun to sink. The deeper the drainage, the drier the peat became. And the drier it became, the more it compacted under its own weight. By the mid-1640s, some parts of Little Holland may have sunk as much as a foot below sea level. The embankments, never reinforced properly, could not hold forever. What's striking is this. The tragedy was not caused by a storm alone. It was a slow betrayal. Each ditch, each sluice, each deferral of repair was a thread unraveling. The flood of 1651 may have been the final surge, but the failure had already taken root decades earlier, and yet few would remember it as such. In popular accounts, Little Holland simply disappeared. Folk stories blamed a wrathful sea, or even old spirits of the fen reclaiming their ground. In the oral tradition of Lincolnshire passed down through farmhands and barge workers, Little Holland became a cautionary tale. Don't build where the land don't breathe. But some did remember. In 1695, a young cartographer named Henry Blome made a new map of the Lincolnshire coast. On it, near the flatlands east of Holbeach, he drew a thin gray circle just offshore. Next to it, in careful script, he wrote, "Site of Little Holland, formerly Veerland, lost to tide April 1651," and beneath it, a short Latin phrase, "Non semper mane quod vincimus." That which we conquer does not always remain. Even now, more than 300 years later, satellite imagery shows faint discolorations in the salt marsh, long lines of denser vegetation where drainage ditches once ran, and a strange oval shape where the village core might have stood. At low tide, fishermen claim to hear odd echoes out on the flats. Some say the sea still remembers, but perhaps the most enduring trace is in policy. The failure of Little Holland, quiet, undramatic, largely forgotten, helped spur later reforms in fen drainage and flood management. More rigorous inspection. Laws were passed. Landowners were required to fund ongoing embankment maintenance, not just initial construction. And Dutch engineers, while still respected, were no longer deferred to without question. The lesson was simple, though hard-earned. You cannot build permanence on borrowed land, especially not if you ignore its breadth, its history, its hidden slopes. But what happened to the families? Where did the Martins, the Rolofses, the peat cutters, and eel haulers go when the land gave way beneath them? That question remains unanswered, and perhaps it always will. Unless, of course, a letter, a diary, a faded will emerges from some attic or archive and gives voice to those who disappeared not beneath rubble, but beneath the waterline. And we must ask, what does it mean for a place to vanish? Not in fire or war, but in tide and silence. And is there a difference, really, between forgetting and being forgotten? You walk now, if you ever choose to visit, along the edge of a landscape that barely admits it had once been anything else. The Wash, a broad estuary that cradles the Yne. Lincolnshire coast, stretches into a gray, glimmering nothing. Salt marsh and sky melt into one another, and the horizon vanishes into haze. There are no signposts to Little Holland, no monument, no trail, only the quiet. And yet, in that quiet, the past lingers. You might ask, why does a lost town matter? It left no abbey, no battlements, no lineage of kings. It fed no armies and housed no saints. Little Holland, Veerland more accurately, was just one among dozens of small settlements along the English coast that vanished to erosion, flood, or economic entropy. But perhaps its story speaks louder precisely because it is so ordinary. Because it is about land and loss, and the arrogance of believing that nature can be persuaded without consequence. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as drainage continued to reshape eastern England, the story of Little Holland flickered in and out of notice. A traveler named Celia Fiennes, journeying in 1698, passed near the marshes and noted in her diary, "There was talk among the local folk of a village taken by the sea, though none would say where it lay, save to the east, under the gulls." A century later, an 1803 agricultural report referenced an area of drowned land near Holbeach once attempted by the Dutch, citing subsidence due to excessive drainage. The name Veerland was listed in a footnote. The map it referred to was already out of print. By the mid-1800s, the land itself was reshaping once more. Reclamation efforts, spurred by Victorian confidence and industrial machinery, pushed new seawalls further outward. Where Little Holland once stood, a new landscape took shape. Marsh turned to pasture, water channels straightened, pump stations built. But the land remained treacherous. Farmers in the area reported odd sinkholes. Horses would occasionally founder in seemingly solid fields. In 1879, a heavy plow disappeared into a sudden pit of black water. The farmer swore he heard a hollow clanging, like metal striking wood beneath the soil. They said nothing came back. Up. Curious minds, amateur antiquarians mostly, began to investigate. One man, Samuel Cartwright, a retired school teacher from Spalding, took particular interest. Between 1892 and 1901, he walked the marshes weekly, carefully noting tide patterns and elevations. His journals, later deposited in the Lincolnshire archives, contain an eerie observation. On days of extreme low tide, I have observed wooden stumps arranged in linear fashion, half buried in the silt. They resemble the remains of a palisade, perhaps a boundary. No such construction is listed on modern surveys. Might this be Veerland's western edge? He even attempted a crude excavation, but found nothing more than fragments of clay tile and some peat-darkened timbers, too rotted to identify. Still, he was convinced. By 1907, Cartwright had self-published a pamphlet titled The Lost Village of the Wash, arguing that Little Holland had been a real settlement lost to subsidence and flood. It sold few copies and was mocked by local newspapers as a fantasy born of salt fog and too much solitude. But Cartwright's theory survived him. In the 1920s, aerial photography, then a new technology, revealed something astonishing. When flown over during the driest parts of summer, the salt marsh northeast of Holbeach revealed crop marks, long, regular rectangles of lighter vegetation. These phantom fields, as they came to be called, matched the spacing and alignment of Dutch fen settlements. One area, roughly 250 meters long and 100 meters across, bore a faint cross pattern, suggesting a central street, perhaps a church, and radiating paths outward. Was this the heart of Veerland? We will likely never know for certain. Coastal erosion, modern farming, and natural decay have blurred the lines. But in 1994, a dig conducted by the Fenlands Research Group uncovered fragments of 17th century roof tile and a piece of blackened iron, likely part of a door hinge, buried beneath 2 feet of salt silt, exactly where Cartwright had described. A marker was placed nearby, just a small, inconspicuous stone, no plaque. No fanfare. It reads, simply, Little Holland reclaimed 1651, and below it a Latin line carved shallow into the stone. Terra mer fuit, iterum erit. The land was sea, it will be again. Today, the surrounding region is protected under the UK's managed realignment strategy, a recognition that some coastal areas can no longer be defended indefinitely against the sea. Instead, certain regions are allowed to return to salt marsh, creating buffers against flooding. In essence, the sea is being invited back. Ironically, this echoes the earliest Dutch philosophy, that land should not be conquered outright, but negotiated, yielded to in measured ways, with humility. Perhaps that's what Vierland's story teaches best. Not merely that a town can vanish, but that forgetting why it vanished is the greater danger. That hubris leaves no footprint, but its weight is felt for generations. The sea, after all, is patient. It does not rage when ignored. It waits. And then, when the time is right, when the embankments weaken, the records yellow, and the lessons are tucked too far back on the shelf, it reclaims, not in vengeance, but in balance. And as you stand there, on the edge of the flat world, you might feel it. Not fear, but awe. A quiet understanding that nothing is ever truly lost beneath the waves, just waiting to be remembered. Story 6. The Lighthouse and the Three Keepers. It is December 12, 1900. On the desolate edge of the Hebrides, some 20 miles west of the Scottish mainland, the Flannan Isles lie scattered like the teeth of a drowned beast. 8 rocky islands rising steeply from the Atlantic, wind-scoured and sea-bitten. The largest among them, Island Moor, is barely large enough to hold the structure perched at its summit, a stone tower of pale brick and black iron. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Completed in 1899 after 4 years of difficult construction, the lighthouse was a modern marvel of its kind. Built by the Northern Lighthouse Board, it stood 75 feet high, its beam visible for nearly 24 nautical miles on clear nights. Its job was simple, but essential: prevent ships from running aground in one of the most treacherous corners of the British coast. But the light did not run itself. 3 keepers were assigned to the Flannan post at any given time, 2 on duty, 1 ashore on leave, rotating in 6-week intervals. Life was regulated by the light and the weather. Food and coal were delivered by supply ship once every fortnight, weather permitting. Communications with the mainland were impossible except by ship. There was no radio, no telegraph, only the schedule, the logbooks, and the hope of good seas. At the end of 1900, the keepers on station were Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. They were not adventurers. They were not madmen. They were ordinary working men with families, savings books, oil-stained hands, and responsibilities that extended no farther than the reach of the light beam. Their days followed a script written in kerosene and stone. The Keeper's Handbook, issued by the Northern Lighthouse Board, laid out strict expectations. At sunrise, the lamp was extinguished and polished, the reflectors cleaned, the lens checked for cracks, logs were updated, pressure gauges examined, barometer readings written down twice daily, weather observations hourly. At midday, the foghorn. Machinery was inspected, though at Flannan there was none installed yet due to budget constraints. The fog, however, was frequent and thick, clinging to the cliffs like unwashed wool. In its place, keepers rang bells or fired warning rockets from the rock face when visibility dropped. Meals were basic: salted fish, oatcakes, boiled potatoes, tea. Supplies were kept in a small stone storehouse at the cliff base. Water was collected from rain or shipped in barrels. On clear days, one keeper might take a half-hour walk around the island's perimeter, if the wind permitted. They were not permitted to leave the island under any circumstances. And still, they endured. What is often lost in the mystery that would later consume Flannan is the sheer monotony. The keeper's logs, most of which still survive from similar lighthouses, tell the real story. Page after page of wind direction, pressure drop, lantern status, wick condition, seabird activity. Here's a typical entry from a nearby station. April 3/1898, cloudy. Wind SE, force 4, bar, steady. Lantern trimmed 4:48 p.m., light burning steady. Keeper McBride strained wrist moving oil drum. There is no poetry here. But there is the quiet rhythm of people living at the edge of survival. Not in war or starvation, but in solitude, repetition, and responsibility. For lighthouse keepers, the world narrowed to the diameter of the lantern, lens. And with that narrowing came peculiar adaptations of the mind. A keeper learned to read the sea like scripture. He watched the patterns of birds, the slow green boil of wave against basalt, the creak of winches in the wind. He learned to sleep in 4-hour shifts, to wake instantly to the clang of an emergency bell. He measured time not in hours or days, but in coal consumption, fog events, and wick replacements. Letters home were treasured. A note might take 2 weeks to reach the mainland, and another 2 to receive a reply. By the time a man knew whether his wife was ill, or if a child had broken a bone, the crisis had likely passed, or worsened. But the letters were written. Anyway, always beginning the same. My dear Anne, I hope this finds you in good health. Imagine writing such a thing from a rock where even the sheep refuse to graze. In one case from a neighboring post, a keeper recorded in his journal, "Dreamt of a meadow. Smell of buttercups so strong I thought I had a stroke. Woke up to seabirds. Eating our biscuits. Stupid creatures. What does it do to the mind to count days not by the sun, but by the reappearance of the supply boat? And what does it mean to be utterly alone, yet always under duty?" The keepers were never meant to be remembered. Their lives were constructed to be invisible, reliable, without drama. Even when things went wrong, a storm, a fall, a broken lantern, the records are clipped and brief. But on Flannan, something did go wrong. By December 26, 1900, all 3 keepers would be gone. No trace left but an overturned chair, an untouched meal, and a log that ended mid-sentence. But we are not there yet. Before the mystery, there were years of routine. Of 3 men rising before dawn to polish glass. Of watching, always watching, for ships and weather and signs of wear. Of listening to the waves booming in the sea caves beneath their feet. Of holding, perhaps just barely, to their place in the world, while the sea waited as it always does for a slip. But what exactly was that final entry? And what could have happened between the last written word and the silence that followed? Was it madness, storm, or something even more mundane, yet no less terrible? Let us read between the lines of the final days. You open the lighthouse logbook. Again, not the Flannan one, for that has vanished or remains sealed, but those from other stations. The handwriting is typically neat, uniform, the entries short, and yet they are deeply human in their brevity. There is a quiet devotion in their minimalism. These men wrote not for history, but for the next shift, the next keeper, for duty, not legacy. So when we turn to the Flannan story again, we must remind ourselves, this is not about what was written, but about what ceased to be written. The last confirmed log entry from the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was dated December 13, 1900. Weather high winds. Barometer, falling, sea, rough, light, functioning. All keepers present, then nothing. For 12 days, the light did not shine. On December 26, 1900, the relief vessel Hesperus set out from Breskleet on the Isle of Lewis. It had been delayed by a major winter storm, one of the worst in memory according to the Lewis Harbor log. The seas were still choppy, though the skies had cleared. On board was replacement keeper Joseph Moore, due to rotate in as part of the regular shift. As the Hesperus approached Island Moore, Captain Jim Harvey noted with concern that there was no flag hoisted on the flagstaff. More troubling, the usual provision crates were still lashed in place on the landing platform. And most ominously, the lighthouse itself stood cold, its lamp dark, its windows blank, like the eyes of something that had forgotten how to see. Moore was put ashore with 2 seamen. The winch railings at the foot of the cliff were intact, but the wooden storage box was empty. The gate to the compound stood open. The grass path up the hill showed no sign of recent foot traffic. At the entrance to the lighthouse, the door was closed, but unlocked. Inside, time had stopped. The clock on the kitchen wall had stopped ticking. An oilskin coat hung on its peg. 1 coat, when 2 should have remained. The beds were unmade. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, untouched. The chairs were pushed back, one fallen on its side. The lamp, which should have been lit nightly, had not been serviced. Its fuel chamber was full. There were no keepers. In his report, Moore wrote with restraint, "I made thorough search. No sign of the men. Found journal entries ceased deck daughter 13. Weather severe thereafter. Light not tended." Captain Harvey ordered an immediate signal sent to the mainland. "Keepers missing. Fear accident." and thus began the speculation. But let's pause. This is not a ghost story, nor should it become one. There are no footprints in the snow, no strange lights on the sea, no monstrous sightings in the dark. What we have instead are facts, wind speeds, maintenance logs, and sea charts, and these suggest something both ordinary and tragic. Along the western cliff of Island Moor lies a narrow shelf of rock known as the West Landing. Unlike the primary dock, which is relatively sheltered, this side faces the open Atlantic. Waves slam the stone with force enough to launch spray 70 feet into the air. Yet it was here that the lighthouse's secondary provisions were stored in a recessed box, bolted to the cliff face. Upon later investigation, the iron railings and crane mechanism at the West Landing were found twisted, their moorings pulled from solid rock. Nearby, turf had been torn clean from the ground, as if by a massive force. A lifebuoy, originally fastened 30 feet up the lighthouse wall, was gone, ripped away. The logical theory emerged. 2 keepers, possibly Duckett and Marshall, had gone down to secure equipment during the storm. A rogue wave, a phenomenon common to that coastline, struck suddenly. Seeing their distress, the third man, MacArthur, had dashed out in desperation, perhaps without even stopping to don his coat. All 3 were lost. This explanation is plausible. In fact, it's mundane. But what makes it haunting is not the mystery. It is the ordinary conditions that made such a tragedy possible, even probable. The keepers lived under constant tension between duty and danger. Their logs show a strict adherence to routine but also subtle indications of pressure. Weather, isolation, and the knowledge that help was always days away created a precarious psychological state. In the Northern Lighthouse Board archives, a letter from a former keeper on the Orkney station reads, "The longer one stands the watch, the more one's mind begins to assign voices to the waves, patterns to the birds. I have more than once spoken aloud to no one at all. There is no reason to believe the Flannan men were unwell, but there is every reason to understand that their environment placed unrelenting demands on physical and mental endurance. A single mistake, descending without proper ropes, a misjudged wave, an untied latch, could mean death." And unlike other professions, a lighthouse keeper's failure did not end with him. It endangered ships, crews, entire convoys. They were the quiet sentinels of the empire, unseen, unthanked, but entirely essential. Their disappearance made headlines, but their lives rarely did. Even the inquiry that followed treated the event with bureaucratic finality. The report concluded that the men had been swept away while attending to their duties in heavy weather. No fault was assigned. No changes in policy recommended, except for improved communication methods and additional safety rails on exposed landings. It was business as usual. Even in tragedy, the families were left to grieve without answers. A widow wrote to the board. He was a good man, not prone to folly. If he went outside, it was because it was his duty. And perhaps that's the answer we seek, not a storm, not a sea monster, not madness, but duty. They died not because they were careless, but because they were careful, doing what needed to be done, even when the odds were cruel. Still, one question remains. Why was the final journal entry written in such haste? Why did it stop mid-sentence? Was there a final moment of realization? A sudden sense that something was wrong? And if so, what was it? They were gone. 3 men erased not by mystery, but by weather, stone, and salt water. Their names, Duckett, Marshall, MacArthur, would echo in headlines and haunt folklore. But it was the silence they left behind that lingered longer. In the days after the discovery, the lighthouse was restored to working condition. New keepers were dispatched. The light, after its 12 days of darkness, returned to its rhythm, rotating steadily through the Hebridean fog. But the Flannan Isles had changed. Visitors to the lighthouse after the incident often reported an oppressive quiet. Not the peaceful kind one finds in forests or churches, but the uneasy hush that seems to press inward. A physical silence. Of course, the islands had always been silent. There were no trees to rustle, no rivers to speak. But now the silence meant something. It was not until the 1920s that wireless radio was installed at remote stations. Before that, keepers were as cut off from the world as if marooned in space. Even the most diligent worker could vanish without explanation. A stone could fall, a wave could strike, a fog could close in. And so, the keepers developed habits of redundancy, formality, and superstition. The Northern Lighthouse Board, perhaps uncomfortably aware of how little control they had over the ocean, began to standardize protocols more rigorously after Flannan. Additional safety ropes, clock-in logs, psych evaluations, lantern rotation checks. But nothing could remove the core truth of the job. It was lonely. It was dangerous. And it was essential. Let us shift our focus for a moment, not to the vanished, but to the ones who came after. Consider the keeper who replaced them, Joseph Moore. After discovering the empty station, he volunteered to remain until the next. Rotation. For weeks, he walked the rooms where Ducat and the others had slept, ate at their table, kept the log going, climbed the tower steps 4 times daily to tend the lamp, all while imagining the final moments of the men who had last walked. There, he later wrote, "I never feared the ghosts of them, only the sea. It was the sea that got them." Perhaps the most remarkable part of Moore's account is how unremarkable he made it sound. He simply resumed the job. There is something quietly heroic in this. That is, after all, the hidden truth of so much forgotten history. The work continued. The logs were kept. The oil was carried up the stairs. The beam swept the black horizon. Ships passed safely, and no one gave thought to the man behind the light. That man, and sometimes woman, was often poor, often overworked, sometimes seasick for months, sometimes mourning a lost child back on the mainland, sometimes whistling alone in the wind to break the stillness, always unseen, and still they kept the light going. Today, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse is automated. No keeper lives there now. It is maintained by engineers who arrive by helicopter a few times a year. The lamp is electric, the foghorn digital, the silence mechanical, but the legacy remains. The story of the 3 keepers is often retold as a mystery, framed in whispers and eerie suggestions. That sells better. That gets clicks. But to view it only through that lens is to miss the quiet reality. They were men doing their jobs, upholding routines so that others could live theirs without fear. In that sense, they are not just a mystery, they are a monument, not in stone or bronze, but in the ongoing safety of coastlines, in the ships that arrive intact, in the children who sleep through stormy nights because the sea is lit. And so we return to the final question. What does it mean to vanish, not in battle or fame, but in duty? Perhaps it means you never truly vanish. You become part of the structure itself, part of the mechanism of history, invisible and unthanked, but enduring. The light keeps turning, and someone somewhere sleeps a little easier because of it. Story 7. The Clerk Who Counted London, You Walk. Down the narrow streets of 17th century London, your boots soft on the worn cobblestones. The smell of smoke and damp wood lingers in the air. A bell rings somewhere in the fog, faint but steady, from a nearby parish church. Along the timbered walls of a baker's shop, a sheet of paper flutters slightly, nailed to the post. You pause to read. Weekly Bill of Mortality. From the 13th to the 20th of December, 1664. Christened, 218. Buried, 573. Of the plague, 28. Of consumption, 53. Suddenly, 8. Of teeth. Too strange, you think. Teeth? But that sheet, modest in its appearance, is part of one of the most important and overlooked data collections in early modern history. And the man who transformed those weekly bills into something more, something lasting, statistical, almost prophetic, was John Graunt. He was not a nobleman, not a physician, not even a university scholar. He was a haberdasher. His shop stood near Birchin Lane, close to Lombard Street. It was a good location, central to the business of the city. Graunt sold buttons, ribbons, needles, and trim. Items small enough to fit in drawers, but essential enough to keep a household running. And yet, in the quiet hours between customers, John Graunt became obsessed with the city's rhythms. You must understand, London in the mid-1600s was not a city of certainty. It pulsed with risk. Plague years came and went, sometimes quietly, sometimes roaring. Fire was a constant fear. Commerce boomed and faltered like a breath. No one knew how many people lived in the city. Not truly. Estimates ranged wildly. But since 1603, the city's parishes had begun compiling weekly bills of mortality, lists of christenings and burials, printed by the company of parish clerks and distributed for a penny a copy. These bills were simple: dates, causes of death, and numbers. Grount began collecting them, week after week, year after year. He filed them by hand. He copied them into books. He noticed things, patterns, trends. He saw that even when plague was absent, death was constant. He observed that infant deaths, often listed as teeth or griping in the guts, remained steady. He compared burial totals during bad harvests and wet summers. No one else had done this. In the 1660s, few people thought to count things that weren't taxes, ships, or barrels of ale. But Grount, quietly and patiently, turned mortality into mathematics. He published his findings in 1662 in a modest quarto volume of 90 pages titled Natural and Political Observations Mentioned in a Following Index and Made Upon the Bills of Mortality. It wasn't a bestseller. It was too dense for the average reader, too speculative for the academic, too mundane for the curious. But it changed everything. In it, Grount asked, how many people live in London? By comparing the average number of burials with estimates of annual mortality rates, he arrived at a figure, approximately 384,000. Remarkably accurate. He created one of the first life tables, calculating how many people were likely to survive to each age. He noted that plague years followed certain patterns. He warned that population density might influence contagion. He didn't use the word epidemiology. That word didn't exist yet, but he was inventing it. And all of this work was done by a man with no formal training in medicine or public health. He had a curious mind and access to dry, repetitive data. Sheets of deaths and births printed in black ink and pinned to church doors. He didn't see them as sad records. He saw them as signals. And therein lies the quiet power of John Grount. He never dissected a corpse. He didn't walk the wards of plague houses or prescribe tinctures. He sat in a shop and counted. And by doing so, he taught the world how to look at death without superstition. He classified causes of death, from rising of the lights to King's evil. He separated accidental deaths from epidemic ones. He counted how many children were buried without being baptized. He wrote, "It may be now asked, to what purpose tends all this laborious bustling and groping, as it were, in the dark?" Then answered his own question. To obtain thereby a more certain judgment of the state and condition of mankind. And so he did. And yet, the story is not without irony. Despite his contributions, Grount's own life was beset by hardship. His business faltered in the 1660s. He converted to Catholicism in a Protestant kingdom, a costly move. He was accused, briefly and wrongly, of being involved in the Great Fire of London in 1666. His later years were marked by debt. He died in 1674, largely forgotten, but the foundation he laid was picked up by others. Edmund Halley, better known for his comet, used Grount's methods to refine actuarial life tables. William Petty, Grount's friend, expanded on the idea of political arithmetic. The bills of mortality became early tools of public health policy. London itself grew more curious about its own shape, its own scale. Later censuses would adopt Grount's principle: count the people, and you begin to understand them. But Grount did not know he would change the world. He simply wanted to know why people died, and in what numbers. He believed that even the humblest records, the death of a child from teeth, the burial of a man found dead in the street, could tell a story, if only someone would read them carefully enough. So the question remains, when you look at a page of numbers, what do you really see?